Wait, what the fuck? Oh, I didn't add it to the stage. That's why. Okay. Funny. Okay. Water, please. Okay. The phrase, the rule of law, first published Wednesday, June 22nd, 2016. The phrase, the rule of law, has to be distinguished from the phrase a rule of law. The latter phrase is used to designate some particular legal rule, like the rule against perpetuities or the rule that says we have to file our taxes by a certain date. Those are rules of law, but the rule of law is one of the ideals of our political morality, and it refers to the ascendancy of law as such and of the institutions of the legal system and a system of governance. The rule of law comprises a number of principles of a formal and procedural character, addressing the way in which a community is governed. The formal principles concern the generality, clarity, publicity, stability, and prospectivity of the norms that govern a society. The procedural principles concern the processes by which these norms are administered in the institutions, like courts and independent judiciary, that their administration requires. On some accounts, the rule of law also comprises certain substantive ideas like a presumption of liberty and respect for private property rights. But these are much more controversial. Section 1 below. See Section 1 below. And indeed, as we shall see, there is a great deal of controversy about what the rule of law requires. Section 1, one ideal among others. Section 2, the contestedness of the rule of law. Section 3, history of the rule of law. Oh, shit. Okay. And then yada, 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 and then yada, yada, yada. Number 1, one ideal among others. The rule of law is one ideal, an array of values that dominates liberal political morality. Others include democracy, human rights, social justice, and economic freedom. The plurality of these values seem to indicate that there are multiple ways in which social and political systems can be evaluated, and these do not necessarily fit tidily together. Some legal philosophers, example Rawls 1977, insist, as a matter of analytic clarity, that the rule of law in particular must be distinguished from democracy, human rights, and social justice. They confine the focus of the rule of law to formal and procedural aspects of government institutions, without regard to the content of the policies they implement. But the point is controversial. As we shall see, some substantive accounts have been developed which amount in effect to the integration of the rule of law with some of these other ideas. Section 2, the contestedness of the rule of law. The most important demand of the rule of law is that people in positions of authority should exercise their power within a constraining framework of well-established public norms rather than in an arbitrary, ad hoc, or purely discretionary manner on the basis of their own preferences or ideology. It insists that the government should operate within a framework of law in everything it does, and that it should be accountable through law when there is a suggestion of unauthorized action by those in power. But the rule of law is not just about government. It requires also that citizens should respect and comply with legal norms, even when they disagree with them. When their interests conflict with others, they should accept legal determinations of what their rights and duties are. Also, the law should be the same for everyone, so that no one is above the law and everyone has access to the law's protection. The requirement of access is particularly important in two senses. First, law should be epistemically accessible. It should be a body of norms promulgated into effect by, okay, proclamation, promulgated. What, bruh? I said, bruh, promulgated. Okay, body of norms promulgated as public knowledge so that people can study it, internalize it, figure out what it requires of them, and use it as a framework for their plans and expectations and for settling their disputes with others. Secondly, legal institutions and their procedures should be available to ordinary people to uphold their rights, settle their disputes, and protect them against the abuses of public and private power. All of this, in turn, requires the independence of the judiciary, the accountability of government officials, and the transparency of public business, and the integrity of legal procedures. Beyond these generalities, it is controversial what the rule of law requires. This is partially because the rule of law is a working political idea, as much as the property of ordinary citizens, lawyers, activists, and politicians, as of the jurists, and philosophers who study it. The feature that ordinary people call attention to are not necessarily the features that legal philosophers have emphasized in their academic conceptions. Legal philosophers tend to emphasize formal elements of the rule of law, such as the rule by general norms rather than particular decrees, rule by norms laid down in advance rather than by retrospective enactments, rule by norms that are made public, not hidden away in the closets of the administration, and rule by clear and determinate legal norms whose meanings is not so vague or contestable as to leave those who are subject to them at the mercy of official discretion. But these are not necessarily what ordinary people have in mind when they call for the rule of law. They often have in mind the absence of corruption, the independence of the judiciary, and the presumption in favor of liberty. Contestation about what the rule of law requires is partially a product of the fact that law itself comprises many things, and people privilege different aspects of the legal system. For some, the common law is the epitome of legality. For others, the rule of law connotes, right? Bro, just give me the fucking connotes. Okay, yeah. The rule of law connotes the impartial application of a clearly drafted statute. For others, still, the rule of law is epitomized by a stable constitution that has been embedded for centuries in the politics of a country. When Aristotle contrasted the rule of law with the rule of men, he ventured the opinion that a man may be a safer ruler than the written law, but not safer than the customary law. In our own era, F.A. Hayek has been at pains to distinguish the rule of law from the rule of legislation, identifying the former with something more like the evolutionary development of the common law, less constructive and less susceptible to deliberate control than the enactment of a statute. There is also continual debate about the relation between law and the mechanisms of government. For some, official discretion is incompatible with the rule of law. For others, it depends on how the discretion is framed and authorized. For some, the final determination of court amounts to the rule of law. For others, aware of the politics of the judiciary, rule by courts, particularly a politically divided court, is as much an instance of the rule of men as the decision of many other junta or committee. Waldron to them. The fact that the rule of law is a controversial idea does not stop various organizations from trying to measure its application in different societies. Groups like the World Justice Project concoct criteria and indexes of the rule of law, ranking the nations of the earth in this regard. Countries like Norway and New Zealand rank at the top of the rule of law league, and countries like Zimbabwe and Afghanistan at the bottom. Criteria can be hardly described as rigorous, but people in business value these rankings as part of their estimation of country risk for foreign investments. Section 3. History of the rule of law. The rule of law has been an important ideal. Let's put 15 minutes and see where we get. Section 3. The history of the rule of law. The rule of law has been an important ideal in our political tradition for millennia, and it is impossible to grasp and evaluate modern understandings of it without fathoming the historical heritage. The heritage of argument about the rule of law begins with Aristotle. It proceeds with medieval theorists like Sir John Fortescue, who sought to distinguish lawful from despotic forms of kingship. It goes on through the early modern period in the work of John Locke, James Harrington, and oddly enough, Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli. In the European Enlightenment, in the writings of Montesquieu, and others, in American constitutionalism in the Federalist Papers, and even more forcefully in the writings of the Federalist opponents, and in the modern era, in Britain in the writings of A.V. Dicey, F.A. Hayek, Michael Oakeshott, Joseph Raz, and John Finnish. And in America, in the writings of Lon Fuller, Ronald Dworkin, and John Rawls. Because the heritage of this idea is so much a part of its modern application, a few highlights need to be mentioned. 3.1. Aristotle. The work of Aristotle on the rule of law is still influential. Though he formulated the question of whether it was better to be ruled by the best man or the best laws, he approached that question realistically, noting that it depended not only on the type of law one was considering, but also on the type of regime that enacted and administered the law in question. But Aristotle did maintain that law, as such, had certain advantages as a mode of governance. Laws are laid down in general terms, well in advance of the particular cases to which they may be applied. Moreover, laws are made after long consideration, whereas decisions in the courts are given at short notice, which makes it hard for those who try the case to satisfy the claims of justice. There were, he conceded, some cases so fraught with difficulty that they could not be handled by general rules, cases that required the focused insight of particular judges. He used the term apecia, sometimes translated as equity, but these cases should be kept to a minimum in legal training, and legal institutions should continue to play a role in the way that they are disposed of. Aristotle's discussion of the general desirability of rules and his treatment of apecia continue to influence modern jurisprudence. From difficult that they cannot be handled by general rules, cases that require the focus insight of particular judges. Okay. Section 3.2, John Locke. John Locke is the second of his two treatises of government, emphasized the importance of governance through established standing laws promulgated and known to the people. He contrasted with the rule by extemporary arbitrary decrees. Now the term arbitrary can mean many different things. Sometimes it means oppressive. But when Locke distinguished the rule of settled standing laws from arbitrary decrees, it was not the oppressive sense of arbitrary that he had in mind. In this context, something is arbitrary because it is extemporary. There is no notice of it. The ruler just figures it out as he goes along. It is the arbitrariness of unpredictability, not knowing what you can rely on, being subject, as Locke put it, to someone's sudden thoughts or unrestrained, and till the moment unknown, wills without having any measures set down which may guide and justify their actions. In Locke's story, one of these things that people wanted to get away from in the state of nature was being subject to others' incalculable opinions, even when those others were thinking as hard and rigorously as they could about natural law. Your thinking might be different from my thinking, and it might turn out that your view of the relation between your interest and my interest in your property and my interest might be quite different from my view of the matter, and quite different again from the view of the next person I came across. The whole point of moving from a state of nature to a situation of positive law was to introduce some predictability into this picture. Unfortunately, having laid down this requirement, Locke complicated matters by adding a substantive principle of respect for private property. The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. And any law that purports to do so is of no validity. But then there is a difficulty. Though Locke gave us his own theory of pre-political property rights, the so-called labor theory in Chapter 5 of Second Treatise, it was itself far from uncontroversial. People in our day, as in his, disagree about the rival claims of labor and occupancy. They disagree about the background of common ownership, and they disagree about how much anyone may appropriate and how sensitive his appropriation must be to the need of others. We disagree about all that in ways that were made evident. For example, in the debates about Lockean theory of Robert Nozick, and Locke and his contemporaries disagreed too, Locke knew and signaled in a number of places that he knew just how controversial all this was. For Locke's awareness of its controversies, but by insisting, therefore, that the positive law is subject to the substantive constraint, Locke subjected the legislator to a discipline of uncertainty, because the natural right of property was controversial, so the administration of any substantive constraint along these lines was bound to be controversial. And because the substantive constraint was supposed to affect the validity of positive law, the effects would be that some people, let's say those who disagreed with Locke about the claims of labor over occupancy, would disagree with him about which positive rules of property are valid and which are not. How many of these fucking people do we have to go through? Okay. Not that many. Okay. Hayek. Okay. Where are we at with the recording, actually? Sorry, I'm being a baby. Montesquieu. Montesquieu's work on the rule of law is best known in connection with his insistence on the separation of powers, particularly the separation of judicial power from executive and legislative authority. See Montesquieu, blah, 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 blah. The judiciary has to be able to do its work as the mouthpiece of the laws without being distracted from fresh decisions made in the course of its consideration by legislators and policymakers. Montesquieu's views on the separations of power have a profound effect on the American founding, particularly in the work of James Madison. Elsewhere, in the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu's developed a theory of the value of legalism, noting that the despotic governments tend to have very simple laws which they administered peremptorily. Oh shit, they can't even give me like a simple fucking. Peremptorily means acting in decisive, commanding way that allows for no denial, refusal, or debate, expecting immediate obedience, often with an assertive, almost dictatorial tone. Peremptorily. Pronunciation. Can I just get a fucking simple peremptorily? Peremptorily. Okay, yeah, peremptorily. Administered peremptorily. I'm just gonna say torally. I'm sorry. I'm fucking American. Noting that despotic governments tend to have very simple laws, which they administered peremptorily, with little respect for procedural delicacy, Montesquieu argued that legal and procedural complexity tended to be associated with respect for people's dignity. He associated this sort of respect with a monarchy ruling by law as opposed to despotism. In monarchies, the administering of a justice that hands down decisions not only about life and goods, but also about honor requires scrupulous inquiries. The fastidiousness of the judge grows as more issues are deposited with him, and as he pronounces upon greater interest. Sorry, I'm stretching my neck. The emphasis of the value of complexity, the way in which complicated laws, particularly laws of property, provide hedges beneath which people can find shelter from the intrusive demands of power, has continued to fascinate modern theorists of the rule of law. In the modern debate, we also hear echoes of the doctrine propounded in the spirit of the laws. Things that depend on principles of civil right must not be ruled by principles of political right. Civil right, Montesquieu's words for what we call private law, is, he said, the palladium of property. The palladium? The palladium. Yeah, the palladium of property, and it should be allowed to operate according to its own logic, not burdened with the principles of public or political regulation. A failure of the rule of law in this regard is likely to lead to the impoverishment of an economy as expectations collapse and owners' incentives for production and enterprise are undermined. Oh my. Liberal values. Writing in the second half of the 19th century, Albert van Dijk bemoaned what he saw as a decline in respect for the rule of law in England. The rule of law used to be a proud tradition that distinguished governance in England both from the executive domination of droit administrative. What does droit mean? Okay, a right or due. Droit? Domination of droit administrative in France, and also from the fatuous. Bro, they're using a lot of crazy terms in here. Fatuous? Silly and pointless. Yes, from the fatuous and abstract certainties of paper constitutions in countries like Belgium, etc. For Dicey, the key to the rule of law was legal equality. With us, no man is above the law, and every man, whatever be his rank or condition, is subject to the ordinary law of the realm and amenable to the jurisdiction of the ordinary tribunals. Attractive as this is in the abstract, it has exhibited a certain naivete so far as the legal position of state officials was concerned. Officials are and often need to be treated differently in law than their ordinary citizen. They need certain extra powers, and they need to be hemmed in by extra restrictions, so that they can be held accountable for the actions they perform in the name of the community. For the ordinary person, the rule of law generates a presumption in favor of liberty. Everything which is not expressly prohibited is permitted. But for the state and its officials, we may want to work with the contrary presumption. The state may act only under express legal authorization. Dicey had a knack of expressing the rule of law in terms of principles whose eloquent formulations belied their deeper difficulties. His first principle of the rule of law was no man is punishable or can be lawfully made to suffer in body or goods except for a distinct breach of law established in the ordinary legal manner before the ordinary courts of the land. This seems fine if we're talking about the imposition of criminal sanctions, but made to suffer in goods can also be read to connote the imposition of restrictions on the use of personal or corporate property, or the giving or withholding of licenses, grants, and subsidies. It can be read as precluding any form of discretionary regulation. Dicey was indeed inclined to disparage all administrative discretion, particularly where it seemed to be superseding what had traditionally been regarded as judicial functions. But can we really do without discretion in modern governance? Some modern scholars of administrative law have denounced Dicey's account as an extravagant, absurd, and pernicious version of the rule of law. 3.5. Right? F.A. Hayek was by training an economist. Economist, but he also nurtured an interest in the relation between legal structures and forms of national economy. Okay. Sorry, I'm just like, how long? Fuck it. Okay. But he also nurtured an interest in the relation between legal structures and form of national economy. Hayek's work on the rule of law proceeded in two phases. One, from his wartime book, The Road to Serfdom, 1944, through to The Constitution of Liberty, Hayek, 1960. And two, the somewhat different account presented in his trilogy, Law, Legislation, and Liberty, 1973, an account which is more congenial to the spirit of common law and hostile to the role of legislation. 1. Governance during wartime necessarily required total mobilization and management of all the society's manpower and resources. Hayek warned in 1944 against the retention of anything like this mode of administration in peacetime. He made an eloquent argument that in normal times a society need not be managed but should be governed, and its people largely left to their own devices, within a framework of general rules laid down in advance. These rules would operate impersonally to protect people from one another, not being aimed at any person or situation in particular, and not being dependent for their operation or any expectation on the part of government as to what the particular effects of their application would be. But this lack of particular knowledge on the part of the government would be offset by the fact that rules would provide a framework of predictability for ordinary people and businesses. They would know that they would not be molested by the state, provided. That's not fucking funny. Why did I laugh at that? That's not funny, bro. They would not know that they would know that they would not be molested by the state, provided they operated within the parameters of the general and impersonal rules. Human freedom, on Hayek's account, did not preclude all state action, but it does require the state action be calculable. 2. In the 1970s, Hayek began to rethink all this. The attention was still on the implications of rule of law for liberty. But now Hayek began to wonder whether the text of clear general legislated rules would really provide an appropriate framework for freedom. It was, he said, a mistake to think that by confining the judge to the application of already articulated rules, we will increase the predictability of his decisions. Articulated rules are often a very imperfect formulation of principles which people can better honor in action than express in words. He favored something more like a common law model of predictability, with principles and solutions emerging from a series of judicial decisions in an almost evolutionary way. The evolution of principles that distinguished themselves by their reasonableness was superior, Hayek thought, to the deliberate imposition of rules by a legislator. According to Hayek, the legislative mentality is inherently managerial. It is oriented in the first instance to the organization of the state's own administrative apparatus, and its extension into the realm of public policy generally means an outward projection of the sort of managerial mentality with frightful consequence for liberty and markets. Section 3.6, Fuller. Lon Fuller believed that government, in accordance with the forms and procedures of law, had a distinctive value that could help close the gap of separation between positive law on the one hand and morality and justice on the other. The conventional wisdom of the legal positivists held that laws could be impeccably drafted and even handily administered and still be hideously unjust. Antebellum slave law in the United States and apartheid law in South Africa were often cited as examples. But Fuller believed, as a matter of political psychology, that there would be a reluctance to use the forms of law, general and public norms, to embody and inscribe injustice. He believed that coherence and goodness had more affinity than coherence and evil. He thought bad things happened in the dark as opposed to the sunlight of legality, and he maintained that even in the most perverted regimes, there is a certain hesitancy about writing cruelties, intolerances, and inhumanities into law. Fuller acknowledged that this link between legality and justice was tentative. It was certainly controversial. But whether this connection held or not, he also wanted to insist that the complete absence of respect for formal criteria of legality might deprive a system of power of its status as law. When a system calling itself law is predicated upon a general disregard by judges of the terms of the laws they purport to enforce, when the system habitually cures its legal irregularities, there it is. When the system habitually cures its legal irregularities, even the grossest by retroactive statutes, when it has only to retort to forays of terror in the streets, which no one dares challenge, in order to escape even those scant restraints imposed by the pretense of legality. When all of these things have become true of dictatorship, it is not hard for me, at least, to deny to it the name of law. In his 1964 book, The Morality of Law, Fuller formulated principles of what he called the inner morality of law. Principles requiring that laws be general, public, prospective, coherent, clear, stable, and practicable. And he argued that these were indispensable to lawmaking. Reviewing Fuller's book, H.L.A. Hart asked in what sense these principles could be called a morality. These seem to be more like instrumental principles for effective legislation, and on Hart's view, they were only as moral as the enterprise they made possible. Fuller responded by denying the significance of his 8 principles were purely instrumental. They also constituted a morality of respect for the freedom and dignity of the agents addressed by the law. What they made possible was a mode of governance that worked through ordinary human agency rather than short-circuiting it through manipulation or terror. This thesis was separate from the connection between law and morality intimated in Fuller 1958. But the two accounts of the moral significance of law were connected in a way that John Finnish explained. A tyranny devoted to pernicious ends, pernicious, having a harmful effect, especially in a gradual. A tyranny devoted to pernicious. Yes, okay. A tyranny devoted to pernicious ends has no self-sufficient reason to submit itself to the discipline of operating consistently through the demanding processes of law. Granted that the rational point of such self-discipline is the very value of reciprocity, fairness and respect for persons which the tyrant ex hypothesis holds in contempt. Fuller's work on the rule of law had one last nuance. He understood that law constituted a distinct kind of governance that may not be relevant for every task of the state. He contrasted it not just with a Nazi-style reign of terror, but with the sort of managerial administration that might be necessary for allocative decision-making in a mixed economy like the United States in the 1960s. In modern political economy, said Fuller, we face problems of institutional design unprecedented in scope and importance. Focusing more on the procedural side of the rule of law, Fuller insisted that we lawyers acknowledge that although adjudication is a process with which we are familiar and which enables us to show to an adjudication acknowledge that although adjudication is a process with which we are familiar and which enables us to show to advantage our special talents, still it may be an ineffective instrument for economic management. We're going to stop right there. It's good. It was good reading. It was a very interesting reading. I had a fun time. And I hope you had a fun time. You have a great day. Love you. Bye.